Um, we'll begin starting now. So,
All right.
everybody, St. Patrick's Church is hosting this as part of our Monday night series, but Anthony Visco, who is our neighbor, is the real. He's really put in all the work here, and so we're just as much audience as anyone else. I want to just. My name is Father Timothy Danaher. I've been helping Anthony kind of get this going. And I want to give a very brief kind of theological intro to tonight's topic. Now, the maestro is he's saying you don't want to just always equate, for instance, something that's good like John Paul II's theology of the body with what we're looking at in anatomy. It's a very different way of observing these things. So I don't mean to do too much theological thread, but I want to say basically 4 brief points by way of introduction. This is a Lenten series, and we're leading up to Holy Week and the Passion. And as the letter to Hebrews says, Christ said, burnt offerings you did not prepare for me, but a body you prepared for me. And the offering to forgive sin is Jesus offering his human body. So this is God's great gift, the body. It's the gift offered in marriage between husband and wife. It's the gift offered in sacrifice as Christians, as spiritual worship, offering our bodies in discipline. But it's just great to think that Christ's body, sacred though it was offered. That's what we're really leading up to. The second point is I want to talk about briefly the basic scholastic 3-part teaching, which is that let's look at Adam. Adam was made with kind of 3 ingredients, so to speak. God's grace, which then ordered his soul, which then ordered his body. And there was a harmony and a proper obedience of the body towards the soul, to the soul towards grace. When Adam lost grace, we talk about a woundedness, but that doesn't mean his soul is now bad, his body is now bad. It just means they've lost harmony, lost coordination, but the soul is still good and the body is still good. And that's why Catholics, I think, can approach these things in saying that the loss of grace is a loss of order. Grace ordered to having dominion over the soul, having dominion over the body. We're slowly getting restored back to order. God's healing us. However, it's just worth thinking about that we as Catholics have this clear view of body and soul are still good. They've lost their ordering, but it's not just this, we're not in the dark about that. The third brief thing too, I want to read something kind of very, very simple here, which is from T.S. Eliot. And T.S. Eliot, he has this kind of interesting comment on flesh. And he's a poet, of course, Anglo-Catholic, so lowercase c. But T.S. Eliot's talking about that healing process, how God is slowly forming us. And this is in his 4 quartets. That's the name of the poem. And I love this phrase here, which he says, he's describing how God is working on us. And he's talking about how we're being healed. He says, here, he's talking about arriving finally, body and soul in heaven. He says, in the completion of our partial ecstasy, the resolution of our partial horror. Life is half ecstasy, half horror here, and it's finally to be resolved, fixed, healed. And he says, yet the enchainment now of past and future, woven in the weakness of the changing body, protects heaven and damnation, which flesh cannot endure. I love that notion of Eliot that we will arrive, hopefully we pray, body and soul into heaven. And yet the interesting sort of notion is that the body at the time keeps us here on earth. Anthony was talking last week about how paintings give us a sense of the eternal, the saints and God. And yet here we are with candles burning in the chapel and these other things. And we're reminded we're still here in time. I'm just simply saying the body reminds us of that too. It reminds us that we're of the earth. And the fourth thing to mention simply is that Anthony, I think this is our first PG-13 night class when we're
Yeah.
dealing with the human body. So that's said in a spirit of trust. That's not a warning, but I just tell everybody, welcome to our first, real sort of, uh, we're,
Adult class,
there you go, adult class.
adult
So
education.
it's always good to have you, Maestro Visco. Maybe could we request you turn on a few lights, because as much as we'd like to see your slides, you are in the
Okay.
dark.
Okay.
And last time you went for the chiaroscuro look, which was very intriguing. And
The sun really did go down.
there you are again. I think it's a look. Why change it? But I know Anthony has a whole history of how he formulated this class, how many times he's given this class. So please take it away. And we're happy to have you as always.
Thank you, Father. I'm going to start out with the history of this. By the way, are the opening panels for the Garden of Earthly Delights by Hieronymus Bosch. And if you think of last week where I had the celestial sphere and there's this other round thing in the middle of it that represents the planet Earth, you can see here, this is before 1492. So of course, the Earth is still flat. And that's how we're going to proceed. But within the Garden of Earthly Delights, three major panels. The one on the left shows the Adam and Eve, and in the background, very small, all the different things that they're going to be introduced with and plagued with, and on and on. And this was very sort of common in these altar pieces, that they would start with Genesis. In fact, all four of these talks will be about Genesis, include some aspect of it, of course, leading up to the final one, which includes Holy Saturday. But last week we did creation up until the fourth day. So tonight we're going to cover a bit of the fifth, and of course the sixth in particular, of the creation of all the animals, both in the air and in the sea. And the first task that Adam is given after creation was to, as you can see them up above, to name the animals. And I went to a very good lecture in this little parish, much like what St. Patrick's is offering. I have a wonderful little parish in Florence where we would have these same thing, Monday night talks. And this one was during Advent, however. And the pastor's sister, Maria Pia, is a dottoressa in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. So she put together this this Advent series, which went on for about 6 weeks. And she chose lines from scripture that went on and on, leading up to the incarnation. The first was bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. And she actually brought in a psychologist one night and talked about Adam's naming the animals. And did anybody hear it? Because he named them in his head. Is it part of what they call the bicameral mind, where he heard it, but only he heard it. So the reason why bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh was so relevant to her talk was that it really is the very first line that we know in Genesis that is spoken, that both God and Eve hears it, because the Father presents Eve to Adam, and he says, "This is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh." And the way Maria Pia explained it was that in Old Hebrew, the word "this" doesn't compare to anything that she ever found in Latin or Greek. It is really a this one here, and no other but this one. Very, very specific form of this. So with that, she explained how this really is the first line spoken by God's creation, Adam, in Scripture. But what was significant also was that he says, "Bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh." which can also be interpreted as, at that point in time, as Father Tim said a moment ago, about this grace, that he had the ability to see her from the inside out. Very, very powerful series of lectures that she gave. They were also part of me putting this together. The others were, of course, the years of teaching anatomy, and also looking for a way for students to utilize it. And I put together a series of talks, one in particular called The Use of the Nude, the history of the nude. And I thought that would hopefully get them beyond nude in the studio and have some way of using it. Here, of course, we see these details of this, almost like a peaceful garden, but the temptation, the fall, the expulsion, all of it in this one panel by Bosch. And the lecture was successful, but it didn't get students sort of stimulated to actually do anything with it. So showing different examples of how it's been used through history, these 4 different types of nudity. I presented it at a local museum, which will not be mentioned here, but my hostess, as soon as I said in the beginning that I'm going to discuss 4 types of nudity, she blurted out, "Says who?" I didn't say anything. And at the end of the lecture, one of the women in the audience said, "Mr. Visco, is this getting any better?" And I said, "Actually not. At the academy, we have the student annual right now, and a teacher was taking her group through, and she told them to lower their heads, lower their heads and shield their eyes. And it was really just a pretty regular painting of nude in the studio, but they weren't supposed to look at it. So my hostess again hollered out, "You can thank the Catholic Church for that." And I said, this was not planned. It just came out. And I said, "No, actually, the Catholic Church is the safest place for the nude." And that sort of made me put this together in a much different way. And I'm sort of happy to look at this as something that was not expected, but boy, did it clarify things for me. Here's the temptation. Now, you can look at the difference here. We're going to talk about this more in the final lecture, the 4th lecture. But notice that this creature is neither clearly male nor female, animal or beast. This is something else. And for centuries, artists depicted it this way, intentionally, because the tempter is supposed to be ambiguous. You don't know what it is. It's meant to deceive. It's all about deception. Of course, Adam, not paying attention, blames Eve, even though he didn't do anything to stop the serpent or the beast or whatever you choose to call it. But unacceptable. He's just as culpable. In fact, when they're searched for in the garden, the famous lines are, "Where are you? I'm hiding. Why are you hiding? Because I'm naked." Who told you you were naked? Which is, in essence, is who told you I made something imperfect? Who told you I made you without? You've been deceived. And so some will say that the sin was not, and of course not genital, because they already were wed in order to multiply. But and you can see they're covering their faces. I remember Rollo May once said, he was a great writer on these things, and he was being interviewed. He wrote a book called Man's Search for Himself, and also The Courage to Create, this back in the late 60s, early 70s, when pornography was getting bigger and bigger. And Rollo May said, "We have removed the fig leaf from our genitals and we put it on our faces." I think we hear things like that in John Paul II much later. This is a stained glass window from St. Rita of Cascia's shrine here, with the expulsion from the garden and the promise of the Immaculate Conception. The promise of redemption is already there. What's interesting is whoever put the iconographic schedule together, they're just amazing. So we have the expulsion from the garden and the first station. So we see throughout history this sort of bringing these things together of the fall, redemption, not to be so separated. In fact, we have that wonderful Fra Angelico did it a few times where there's the Annunciation and the expulsion from the garden in the same panel.
And Anthony, one quick thing, because you and I had talked about this, just to elaborate, this whole sense of Adam and Eve feeling naked. We had talked about this, that it's this sense of feeling lack, like Satan had tempted them and saying, "Oh, you didn't know God had a knowledge of good and
God
evil."
did not.
Can you
Yes, you're
elaborate? Just
lacking.
elaborate on that very briefly before
Absolutely.
moving on.
So the idea is not the idea, but the realization or the thought was that God made you incomplete. They were convinced, they were duped by this. So that's why they essentially, God's who told you I made you naked, meaning who told you I made you without. So we start to see in art that nudity is being, there's one side or the other. There's before the fall or after the fall. There's the nude and the naked. The nude being complete, the naked being incomplete or without or lacking, or the belief that they're lacking. This is a wonderful panel of St. John the Baptist explaining to Eve and both the law on one side and the gospel and grace on the other, which is what Father talked about earlier. So the law of Moses on one side, the brazen serpent on one side, Christ on the other, the sin on one side, the Agnus Dei on the other. I'd love to see artists doing these things today, but the four types of nudity that Ferguson describes in his Signs and Symbols of Christian Art, which is still available. Some people asked me last week what books. This is one of them, Signs and Symbols of Christian Art by Ferguson. The wonderful thing about the Ferguson book is all the examples he uses are in our National Gallery in DC. So we have nuditas naturalis. This more or less is how we are born. We come this way. Nuditas virtualis, which is virtuous nudity. Now, granted, we borrow this from the Greco-Roman world, both for male and female figures, where they are needless. They are not lacking anything. So they're using nudity in the sense that these people are not have no need for worldly goods, such as clothing. Nuditas temporalis. This is nudity for temporal reasons. I'm taking a bath. I'm being baptized, actually. The flood. All these different types of temporal nudity. Nuditas criminalis. This is the one where we are stripped, we are naked, and either by force or by accident, either way, it gets considered nuditas criminalis. By the time Ghiberti did the Doors of Paradise, all four types were included. This is how common this knowledge was at one point in time. So in this is number one panel of the creation. We have nuditas naturalis and we've got nuditas criminalis, nuditas virtualis, all of it. And the more we look at the panels, it's all in there. So of course, nuditas naturalis is our birth of Adam and Eve, the birth of Christ. If you notice that in most of these paintings of this era, Christ is completely nude. Virtualis is the hero, Samson. David is by Mantegna. This is in the National Gallery. This is Domenico Veneziano. This is St. John the Baptist before he goes into the desert. So he's throwing off his earthly cloak. He's got his camel skin on his back and he's ready to go to work. It's a wonderful little panel. Temporalis. Susanna at the baths. Baptism of Christ. Now, there's an explanation for this that according to tradition, not scripture, oh, sorry, I'll go more on the baptism in a minute. The Good Samaritan. It's a beautiful painting. So again, the nude is someone who is, something has been taken away. Nuditas criminalis, here we have the expulsion of Adam and Eve again. The drunkenness of Noah. And of course, the crucifixion. Christ is seen as a criminal and stripped. The Last Judgment in the earlier traditions was simply Christ enthroned, saints are clothed, and the damned are done in, well, you could see the one with the bishop mitre on, but they're either demonic or they're simply naked. Here's another example of the damned being stripped. Now, here's this, I'm going to expand on this a little bit here. As time goes on, we maintain these 4 different categories of nuditas. Again, here's the Roger van der Weyden Portinari triptych, altarpiece rather. Everyone's clothed except the Christ child. When I first saw this, I really didn't understand it, why the Christ child was without clothing and just laid on the ground like that. And as you start to study these things, you realize the intention and the knowledge of the artists at the time. Here again is the Ghirlandaio. These are mostly Spanish figures that sometimes got clothed and sometimes didn't. This is a Verrocchio relief. Leo Stein, an art historian back in the early 70s, wrote a book called The Sexuality of Christ, and he sort of took it back the other way and spoke about it in those terms, how important it was to prove Christ was a male, and on and on. It didn't go too far. It was interesting, but not enough. This Michelangelo here, the Donitondo, I find particularly interesting because it is Christ with his right arm breaking the scriptures, New Testament and Old Testament. Our Lady sits on a very squared block, which to me is the cornerstone. Iglesia is the cornerstone here. And when people say, do you think they thought this? I think they did. If you notice on because this deals with the veil later, if you notice in all of a lot of these sculptures and paintings, especially Michelangelo, he never lets the Virgin Mary touch the Christ child's skin directly. She's always got a cloth between the two. This is Luini, one of Da Vinci's followers. Again, one wonders, is the thumb between the prayer book there to divide scripture? Here's a wonderful 19th century version of it. She also has a bit of cloth between her and the Christ child, and Saint Joseph. So the nudity of Christ is both naturalis and virtuous nudity. Here's a Caravaggio. We did a bit of him last week when we spoke about tenebrism.
And Anthony, just to clarify, Father Tim here, so the naturalis, is it just emphasizing in these paintings Christ took on human nature, human flesh. Was that the
Absolutely.
emphasis? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's why it continues in things like a heroic David sculpture. David, again, is needless. He's virtuous and needless. And you wonder, you know, when you think about how often in scripture we read dressed, lamp lit, and ready for action. And one might not think this is ready for action, but uh, when you look at it in that sense, he is. It's again an internal clothing that he has, an internal armor that he has. This is another sculpture of Samson and a painting as well. And of course, God David, as we know. Susanna at the Baths is both. This is where it gets sort of playful, where she is temporalis, of course, is bathing, but the onlookers are seeing it as criminal, and yet she's virtuous. So you can have a combination of these elements in one painting or sculpture. Here's a more modern version of Susanna being accused. And of course, in allegory as well, this is Botticelli's La Calunnia, calumny, where everyone is closed except the truth. The truth is needless. And of course, we use terms like the naked truth when she's really the nude truth, but we don't say that. And this is Bernini's truth being revealed by light. I used to show this painting in my classes about drapery and nudity. This is Titian's Sacred and Profane Love. And I'd ask the students, which one's sacred and which one's profane? And they would always say, this is sacred because she's got clothes on. And this one's profane because she doesn't have clothes on. Of course, it's just the opposite. But it starts to show you how far we've come from understanding the use of the body in secular or sacred art, but in particular sacred. Of course, the virtuous nudity is always reserved for the elect. And this is where we'll see in a bit where it sort of overlaps, where both the elect and the damned are nude and naked. Again, Susanna at the Baths, where she's stunned here. It is nuditas conditionalis. The circumcision is another aspect of in dealing with the life of Christ, nuditas temporalis. Baptism, the tradition was Christ was nude because his nude body made the water and sanctified the water. So here we have the Trinity here. Again, the hand of the Father coming out of the cloud, the Holy Spirit. The reasoning behind this that lasted for quite a long time was there were no other witnesses, that the only ones there, even though there's two other figures there, they are outsiders. They did not really see this. As you notice, they didn't witness this. They have no halo. The only witnesses at the baptism were two angels. And we see this over and over and over again. Here it is in Italo-Byzantine tradition. Christ is nude, two angels awaiting, St. John the Baptist. Giotto does the same thing. Again, the other two witnesses are really they are representative more of us more than anything, that we know of it, but we didn't see it. starts to change as the time goes on, where the idea of more and more modesty comes in. However, conventions still try to hold on to as much as possible. These two panels, one is by Pisano, the one where Christ is nude in the water, and the other is by Ghiberti. They're both on the baptistry doors, north and south. But you can see the difference between the Pisano on the left here, using the same conventions, and the Ghiberti, where he's moved on and now doing a more contemporary version with this modesty added. And of course, the Verrocchio, although he maintains John the Baptist, God the Father, the Holy Spirit, and the two angels painted by Da Vinci, he still has Christ clothed here. Also depends on whether or not Christ is submerged in the water, because the water, of course, was a great convention for hiding the nudity of Christ, or at least covering it, giving it some cover. And this, of course, is the outside of the baptistry. Baptism, of course, baptism, of course, is nuditas temporalis as well. This is from the Masaccio cycle. And the flood, nuditas temporalis, but it could also be called nuditas criminalis, because these are the people that chose not to follow the law. This is a 19th century version, and you start to realize that this becomes more or less simply an excuse to do it. This is not, I would not call this sacred art in any way. It's not something one would use for devotion or anything, but just an exercise in accumulating piles of naked people. Nuditas criminalis is probably the most one of the most prominent in our Catholic art, mainly because of the sacrifice of Christ and the fall. So we can see from the catacombs here, these early paintings, and again, this idea that the idea of covering the genitals rather than the face in shame. And of course, we have Facebook to help here, not understanding what it was all about, but help came in the form of John Paul II, when he started giving his talks on the body in particular. He wanted the paintings that had fig leaves covering them to be removed. Now, what's interesting is in this Masaccio, which is one of the earlier ones in Florence, Masaccio didn't paint those leaves over the genitals. Somebody else did. And once they realized that this was not original, he said, this is time to remove them. The shame was in their faces. So this is what you will see today. Another nuditas criminalis is the sacrifice of Isaac. He's usually portrayed stripped, whether in painting or sculpture. Job, another figure that is portrayed naked, without, but a righteous man. So there's, again, you get these combinations. Of nudity. Drunkenness of Noah, again, more formulated, but not in the same sense that we've seen in earlier versions. This again is something that comes out of an academic idea of a way of using nudity. This is more toward what would be considered something that is biblical or scriptural. This is another example of Jacques Tissot, who I spoke about last week, where Ham's brothers are walking backwards with the drapery to conceal their father's nudity. The enslavement of Joseph by his brothers being taken into slavery by the caravan. Again, here's another example by Jacques Tissot that when he arrives to the Pharaoh, he's just been given some, I don't know if it's camel hair or whatever, but he's essentially stripped. Again, Tissot, Christ casting out the demons. He has them as naked. It's the only time he ever uses it in all of his hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of illustrations, biblical illustrations. The only time he uses this type of anatomy is when Christ is confronting the demonic. Here's a father who hears the father bringing his son to Christ to be healed, and again the son is naked. Slaves are always considered stripped, naked, unworthy. And of course, we see this in the despoliation or stripping of Christ. Here's Beato Angelico. And of course, the Spanish Realist School does beautiful work with this and gives a great sense of presence in their statuary. This is unique. I've only seen two versions of this where the Mother Christ takes a cloth and clothes him. So that loincloth that we see on the crucifixes, etc., is really Our Lady clothing her son. Very moving. Another Beato Angelico here. So this idea of Roman crucifixion being stripped totally nude becomes a real moving factor in Renaissance art. So we have Brunelleschi, Donatello, and Michelangelo all doing the crucifixes in the nude. Christ naked, not nude really. And they're still there. Most of them are in churches. They're not museums, which is wonderful. And here's the Michelangelo at Santo Spirito. But the idea of Christ as a stripped slave becomes a dominant factor when we think about the approach of Holy Saturday. And this is his latest Pietà version, the Rondanini. And this is Crucifixion of the Good Thief, and who, again, gets completely stripped. But when we think of the words of the Exultet, which will be sung on Holy Saturday night for the vigil, it makes it very clear. O love, O charity beyond all telling, to ransom a slave you gave away your son. Extremely moving words, and something to be considered when anyone is doing, anyone may be commissioned to do crucifix. Of course, this gets continued in depictions of the martyrs, Saint Andrew being stripped and crucified. Saint Sebastian, who, by the way, doesn't die by these hours. A lot of people think he was a Roman soldier who was stripped. And that's why a lot of times depictions will have his armor and everything else at his feet. He was thrown into the Cloaca Maxima, which is the Maxima, I should say, in Rome, and here's a study for it, and then found by Saint Irena, who healed him back to health, only for him to go and preach at the Forum, and then they killed him and threw him into the Cloaca Maxima, because they thought, oh, another one has resurrected, we must get rid of him. There's a great Carracci painting of Saint Sebastian being tossed into the sewer. His body wasn't found until Saint Ursula had a dream. And he came to her in a dream and said, "My body's in the sewer," and they resurrected it. Exhumed it and gave it proper burial. Saint Eulalia, victim of crucifixion. Now, the Romans weren't beyond stripping women at all. This is Saint Perpetua. This used to be in Brookstone Sculpture Gardens, but it became a little bit bothersome for people, so they had it moved and they gave it to the monks at the Metkin Abbey, where it is now. And the Roman law was you can't crucify or hang or do whatever a pregnant woman. So they allowed Saint Perpetua to go through her pregnancy, nurse the child, and crucify her. So you can see different stages here. And Saint Eulalia, who's also tortured while being crucified. Saint Agatha, again. So how much, how little, whatever, we I think as artists and have to consider these things when commissioned, when we're observing them, that it's not simply about the formalist values or issues of art or the anatomy. It goes beyond that, clearly. This is St. Lawrence. St. Bartholomew. St. Bartholomew, because of his being flayed, becomes this example for us in terms of anatomical study and a wonderful reason to study the body. Because if you don't understand this and you're trying to do this and you obviously someone here understood what's underneath the skin of a flayed figure, where these different muscles meet, et cetera, et cetera. This is a pretty early version, but still pretty good anatomically. And of course, the great sculpture of St. Bartholomew in the Duomo of Milan, which is essentially what we would call today an écorché figure, but nevertheless, this is the reality of his execution. And it's in situ, and it is a shrine. So when we see these examples held in reverence, not because of their great art capacity, but because of their capacity to evangelize as well. As much as people think that the Catholic Church was against dissection, and the Romantics who like to think that people like Michelangelo and Da Vinci just ran around and dug up graves and all those things, it's absolutely not true. It's actually funny. It's hideous, because dissection was indeed permitted. And in fact, in Florence, we still have the hospital of Santa Maria Nuova, which exists and is a fully functioning hospital, which is where Da Vinci did his dissections, and San Marco, where Michelangelo did his. The idea of this dissection was that it could be performed on, especially on someone who had committed crimes, was found guilty, refused to repent, and could not be buried in hallowed ground. Up until that point, most doctors, in the medical field, I should say, dealt with what we call the four humors. and not necessarily anatomies. It was interesting, but it's not what they're basing their healing on. So these four humors, the melancholic, the sanguine, the phlegmatic, and the melancholic, were the reasons why one is not doing well. So they could check blood, check urine, etc., and find out your ailments. But anatomy per se, no. So when we think that this was all quite legal, it becomes somewhat different with Pope Boniface the VIII. When people say the Catholic Church condemned dissection, what happened was Boniface condemned what we call the mos Teutonicus. And if any of you were in Father Tim's lectures last year when he was talking about the not so dark ages, this relates to it in the sense that there was this conflict between North and South. There was this conflict between royalty and non-royals. So during the Crusades, the German aristocracy and the German royalty, in order to have their remains repatriated, they used this method of dismembering and boiling the body to get the bones and send them back to for proper burial in the homeland. So again, whether it's a king or pope, Boniface stopped that practice or forbade it. If it continued, he didn't know about it. But anyway, that was the only law against the body because it was considered desecration. And of course, there's no DNA, there's no anything. So somebody could claim somebody's dead and bring back a bag of bones to someone saying, "I'm sorry, but your son Bruno died, and here's his bones." And it could be pig bones, horse bones, whatever. Also, the selling of relics. So someone comes back and has a piece of pigtail and says, "Oh yeah, this is the finger of Saint John the Baptist." So there are a lot of reasons for stopping the mos Teutonicus. But one thing that was consistent was the use of the nude in terms of the Last Judgment. And so even in early renditions, there are, when we think that a lot of these artists had never seen one, they had to kind of make it up. And some were even, according to Maillet, reluctant in these portrayals because they didn't feel comfortable about it. They didn't really know what they were doing. And also, is this permissible? And of course, the bishop said, absolutely, it must be. This is the body of the resurrection or the damned. There's nothing earthly about it. Now, tradition was either outside the church before you went in or inside the church before you left. So this is Giotto's great Last Judgment in the Arena Chapel. So you'd be reminded on the way out the door that this could happen this week, to be prepared. We don't know the time or the hour. And here, Giotto is pretty much sticking to the idea that the elect are all clothed and the damned are naked, not nude, but naked. The tradition of doing them both nude on one side, naked on the other continues, as we see here. Those in heaven are clothed. Saint Michael here is, of course, with the scales weighing, and we can see them either greeted by, there's Saint Peter on one side, greeting them into the New Jerusalem. on the great altarpiece. This is, again, we can see the damned on one side, and the this is the cover panel, by the way. So we have the Annunciation, the donors. Just to give you an idea of when these panels are open, how expansive the altarpiece is. Now, what I like about this is, if you can see, both figures of the damned and the elect look about the same size, but one weighs more. And I don't know if that's from diet or what, but it looks good. Everybody, by the way, gets a six-pack ab, especially the elect. Now, the reasoning here is, if you look at them, the resurrection body, according to tradition, is 33 years old. So the artists were told, you've got to do this resurrection body, or damned. Although sometimes they'll change with the damned a bit and distort and manipulate, but the elect are all 33. Signorelli does an incredible Last Judgment cycle in the Cathedral of Orvieto. And again, dissection is not known by everyone. They're doing a lot of what we call eyeball anatomy. But here he's got the resurrection of the dead. Receiving their crowns in the background there. And here's the damned. And you can see all the distortions are coming in. They're not even a consistent body color of flesh. This is, I think, quite amazing that the sound of the last trumpet. Some of the creatures he made are something that looks quite out of a more modern sci-fi. But if we look at the skeletal features, he obviously knows the front more than the back, but he really doesn't know the pelvis here. He may have never seen one. In fact, the Latin for pelvis is ulsa nominatus, the bone without a name. It didn't look like anything. Mostly all muscles and bones are named after what they looked like, and we maintain those names till today, mainly because it's convenient. But anyway, the pelvis doesn't look like anything that was recognizable. It's easy to call it the basin, but as a bone, no name. A bone without a name. Da Vinci, of course, observed people getting hung in the Bargello courtyard there in Florence, and could then even do dissections. So obviously in these drawings, you realize that this guy understood the pelvis. He knew how many ribs there were. He knew how they were connected. He knew the function of the shoulder girdle, which again in the Signorelli, that's not clear at all. He's almost got the bones fused. Here's his Saint Jerome in the desert. Now, another reason why artists would want to study anatomy is so that they could put figures in these compositions nude and then drape them. So knowing anatomy also assisted in drapery study. It's interesting that the soldiers here are, again, naked. This is the Massacre of the Innocents. Depraved, lacking, criminal. Here's some Here's Michelangelo studies from Masaccio's drapery. So artists would study drapery from other artists as well. How did he do it? How did she do it? This is Del Sarto. You can see how he's putting drapery over perhaps a nude study done from life, most likely. But and artists also had, and they still have, what we call lay figures, where you make a mannequin and you drape it and you can pin it, because you can't have somebody hold a pose that long and keep the folds in place. So again, these are all, when we look at those the drawings of Michelangelo on the left here, these are memory drawings. This is someone who knows anatomy well enough that he can compose from memory, which is something that also we're seeing come back little by little, the memory figure, drawing out of your head, knowing something well enough that you can just draw these bozzetti or maquettes or whatever we call them and compose. So here's this drawing for St. Lawrence, and there's the painting of the same. The drawings are very small. I don't think we realize today how rare paper, especially parchment, was. When the Sistine Chapel ceiling was completed, it was dedicated on All Hallows Eve in 1541. And this, of course, is after Martin Luther and the Diet of Worms. And there were feelings within the church that perhaps with the Protestant revolt and the rebellion, that we best take care, because they were seeing things being destroyed or banned or defaced. So it was the first time the Catholic Church ever had to examine its work and even defend it. And so all these nude figures, or partially or fully nude figures of Michelangelo, here we have a study that someone did while Saint Catherine was still nude, and Saint Blaise in the background was as well. You can see it's a little bit different here in color and treatment, but nevertheless, every figure had to be somewhat draped. And that was a decision by, not by Michelangelo, but actually by the Council of Trent. What happens is, as I said earlier, Trent starts to look at the anything in the church, and when they see the Sistine Chapel and they see the Last Judgment, they say things like, "He's got wind blowing. There's no wind in eternity. The angels aren't going in the four different directions. That's not scriptural." On and on and on. And Michelangelo more or less didn't argue. He just gave in and said, fine. They felt it was too sensual, but we realize now in hindsight that what Michelangelo is doing is the body electric. He is doing things in a very Pauline sense here. He's making super bodies. He's making bodies that don't really exist in this world. So even the damned had to be clothed in after Trent. Someone asked me last week about books. There's one book, if you could find it. It's by Sir Anthony Blunt. It's called Artistic Theory in Italy from 1450 to 1600, and it mentions Trent and the recommendations made. And we're going to talk about that more next week in terms of image and likeness. The artist who was commissioned, assigned to drape the Michelangelo figures in the Last Judgment, is Daniele da Volterra, very dear friend and a follower of Michelangelo, who just felt so badly about doing it. And Michelangelo said, "Look, it's fine, do it," and gave him his permesso to drape the what was found to be offensive. Now, luckily, Daniele da Volterra is an incredibly gifted drapery painter and drawer. So his work just fit in quite well. Now, back to anatomy. Sistine Chapel, as I said earlier, Sistine Chapel ceiling and the final piece, the Last Judgment, were dedicated in 1541. In the meantime, Vesalius didn't publish the Des Fabrica until much later, not very much later, but this is the uh, theater in Padua. But again, this is relatively new to the medical world in that sense, where now they actually have a text, a volume that goes layer by layer by layer on the human anatomy, which also will say this is how it functions. But again, the use of the body to understand drapery on the figure was all helped in speaking about the, as we said earlier, the incarnation. Again, these were done on lay figures. Also understanding, just as we understand the range of movements within the body, the kinds of things that will generate a fold. How does it happen? What kind of fabric? The 7 different types of folding, there's an anatomy to this as well. And the idea of doing these Last Judgment paintings continued, but as you can see, it's a very clear distinction now where both elect and damned are partially clothed or covering themselves in some way, and not necessarily with a reinvented body, but still maintaining that idea of 33 years old. If there's any, just as the first verse in that is spoken that we know of in Genesis is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. If drapery starts somewhere in Scripture, especially in the New Testament, it's swaddling. That you'll find an infant in swaddle, and again, a great tradition of painting done in swaddling. Here it is in swaddle, the presentation. Beautiful painting. Georges de la Tour, Tenebrous version of this. Of course, the taking on this idea of the Christ child in swaddle became a major theme in the Ospedale degli Innocenti in Florence, where it's the orphans' refuge, the orphans' hospital. So Della Robbia does 8 of these on this wonderful Brunelleschi building. And so that each foundling is to be treated as if the Christ child.
Wow.
It is now, it still functions, by the way, as a hospital and an orphanage, but at a much more diminished space because they've also converted it into a museum. If you ever have the opportunity, I would definitely say go here. It is an incredibly moving place to see the history. A friend of mine, David Battistella, did a film called The Innocents of Florence that hasn't been released here yet. But anyway, it deals with how if there's no children, there's no future. So they have a place there, a door where you could anonymously leave the foundlings, whether they were just abandoned or people didn't want their children anymore, they couldn't afford them, they were bastard children, whatever. And they would usually leave some sort of amulet, a note saying, this is your identity. If I can ever take care of you, if you ever find me, show me this, I'm yours and you're mine. So all those things were recorded and saved. It's quite a moving place. Here's the Grotto, as they call it. And again, you'll find people with a surname like Degli Innocenti, which means that someone in their family line was an orphan, or Roti, who also means that they went through this rotational wheel of someone putting the baby on one side and turning it, saying goodbye. The hospital maintained this ongoing thing of women coming in, wet nurses, nursing the children every morning. And it's also relates to another tradition of no, Our Lady is never seen naked or nude, only for one exception, and that is the lactating virgin, which of course, if there's virgin birth, there's virgin lactation, which of course both are virtually impossible. We know that. But as we see, here's virgin enthroned and crowned with one breast exposed, always one, never more. My personal take on this is that she, as Iglesia, is constantly lactating, but more so that she nurtures both natures of Christ, both the human and divine. Here's a video of Our Lady with St. Joseph nursing the Christ child. The idea of nursing, as we saw in the orphanage, wet nursing, is also seen in the Caravaggio corporal works of mercy, where all 7 corporal works of mercy are combined into one painting, Our Lady of Misericordia. So he's got clothing the naked, but also he's incredibly clever in this, where he has a woman nursing a man whose head's sticking out between the bars. So it's feed the hungry and visit the imprisoned, all in one. This is called Roman charity, where wet nurses and lactating women would actually go to the prisons and allow the prisoners to nurse from them. And here, of course, we have Saint Bernard in the mystical nursing, where Our Lady is giving him her milk. Now, if there's another garment other than swaddling, we can see this in this painting that is from the Ospedale, Our Lady of the Innocenti, where all the innocents are in the bottom row there in swaddle with her mantle. There's the other, I'd say the most, after the swaddle, the most prominent clothing we have in terms of Catholic art is the mantle of Mary. Of course, we recognize this one from last week in the, or when we did, no, excuse me, the one we did with Catholic Art Institute, the altarpiece, Sacred Conversation. It's also representative of the church building itself. And sometimes these commissions would be an entire order is under the mantle of Mary. And we know also from the dialogue she has with Saint Juan Diego, where she reminds him that I am your mother and you are safe in the folds of my mantle. But of course, it's again, Michelangelo with the holding the dead Christ, again with cloth between the hands and the corpus, and his also enfolded in the folds of his mother. So it's no, I don't want any to give the impression that it's the nude over fabric or over drapery. They both have their roles here, but it is easier to drape the figure if you understand the figure. That's for sure as an artist. Here's St. John the Baptist in his camel hair cloak. Another tradition or convention was how to drape or clothe Mary Magdalene. And as the tradition went on, she's either somewhat nude or completely covered with hair. And of course, Saint Martin and sharing his mantle, again, corporal work of mercy, clothing the naked. Clothing also plays an important role in identity. So here we have Saint Benedict of Norcia. It says something about station, choices, all sorts of things. The orders always are very specific. St. Clare. St. Francis Cabrini. And the Capomagna. We still use these things. I can say for a fact that I've been able to include nudity in my commissions. Here's one of Blessed Stephen Bellassini. And I have to say, no one's ever said a thing. Again, as my heckler said, or I said to my heckler, the Catholic Church is the safest place for the nude. Here's two. This is the clay version of the Stations of the Cross that Beryl mentioned last week at Old St. Joe's here in Philadelphia. No one's ever said a word. This is bronze of the Assumption in Atco, New Jersey. This is Our Lady of the Eucharist. Unfortunately, no longer exists. Not because of the nudity as much as a parishioner felt that the Christ child looked like, his words, not mine, a mongoloid idiot. And so the pastor got rid of it. The only thing I could say to the pastor was, would you refuse baptism to a child with Down syndrome? Another topic, by the way, Down syndrome in art. One of the, again, this wonderful little parish that I became part of in Florence, they would invite different people in, sometimes even parishioners that had these wonderful insights into things. And it seems that Mantegna did a series of paintings for the Gonzaga family. And every time there's a child or an angel, in particular the Christ child, it has all the traits of a child with Down syndrome. And this historian felt that this could be very, very true, but that children with Down syndrome were considered very special. And again, lent this to this idea of knowing something that the rest of us don't know. Would it be so horrible to portray the Christ child as a child with Down syndrome? Not that that's scriptural at all, but that's the idea that this is how expansive it is. This is another sculpture I did for St. Thomas of Villanova Friary. And again, the child is nude, St. Thomas holding St. Thomas, Father of the Poor. At the dedication, the prior, I never spoke to him about it, but he got up at the podium and he said, this is a reminder that Christ embraces us in all our nakedness. And I thought, oh, he got it. That's great. Good, good, good. But yes, we do drapery studies as well. These are some of mine done for another project. And of course, understanding and wanting to do more and more anatomy, you get ideas, you read something, you say, I want to do that. So this was a wonderful exercise of Ezekiel in the Valley of Dry Bones. And here's the purification of Isaiah. Scripture doesn't say Isaiah was completely stripped, but it seemed to be a good metaphor for this purification of Isaiah. This is not mine. This is being done by a Spanish artist, and the church intends to display it nude or naked, I should say, and he really did not understand the anatomy of the armpit, which can be rather complicated. So I went over the drawing for him. This is one of my students from last year doing an écorché in the studio here. And it's just a constant study, which never seemed to bore me. I still do it. And these are the hands of the Christ of Holy Saturday at the shrine of St. Rita of Kasha. I found the image of Holy Saturday, which we are approaching, very significant. This was them in the beginning, and little by little, people have touched them over the years and have worn off the patina and worn them down a bit, which I'm delighted by. I like that these things are being used. This is the entire piece here. It really is based on the coffin lid of St. Rita of Kasha, and of course, hundreds and hundreds of other images of this Cristo di Sabato Santo. But is modern research has had it that she actually received the stigmata in front of this Christ of Holy Saturday and not a crucifix. They're mostly 19th century ideas or conventions. This is from the San Marco in Florence, again by Beato Angelico. This is the tabernacle door he does. This idea of Christ alone, half dead, half alive, or in repose in the sepulcher. Holy Saturday. Also, when we think about simultaneity of the harrowing of hell going on, Christ has returned to the Father, sacrifice being completed, but there's this interim period here where he's both. This is a wonderful painting of Christ descending into hell. This is Holy Saturday again, so there's different ways of depicting it, but showing to Adam and Eve his crucifixion. Wonderful invention. But there's another thing that comes from this Cristo di Sabato Santo, and that is that, of course, we say 3 days scripturally, but it's really 40 hours. And where we get the terms Quaresima, right, for in Italian, or Quaresme in French. And also, word very, very familiar to us these days is quarantena, the quarantine. It's all based on the idea of 40. So when we think of the, from the moment of the deposition to resurrection, it does count to 40 hours. So when if your churches do this devotion, not only for Holy Saturday, but 40 hours during the year, it is this that we're commemorating. Living and in repose. But it's the idea that we're at his feet in all these paintings, at least. And then we get to the San Saverio sculpture in Naples. And the other two figures that are veiled as well. One of faith, as she's holding chalice, and one of chastity. Or modesty, excuse me. So we come full cycle in these different traditions of Christ naked, nude, clothed, veiled. and in conversation, as it were, in sacred conversation with these other figures in the space there. And we continue it in a way in our Passion Tide, where we veil our statues, that we're not to be they're not to be seen in their corporeal sense that is taken away from us temporarily during Passion Week. A tradition that's slowly coming back, and that's good to see. I'm going to close the doors now on the Garden of Earthly Delights here. And thank you all for participating. And a reminder of next week's lecture, which will be image and likeness, and how they come together, how they come apart. And again, it's going to tie in with a lot of the things we've been talking about for the last 2 weeks. And I'll turn it back over to Father Tim, and open for questions and answers.
Thank you as always, Anthony. Even though we're on mute, I'll give you a little round of applause. So a few ground rules. We now transition into a little time of Q&A, and I know many people can stay. Some may have to go, but you're free to do either. Some ground rules. There's no questions permitted on mystical nursing of St. Bernard. That's off. That's taboo. And Andy, why don't you also not share screen so then we can see everybody?
Okay, I'm trying to get rid of it here so I can. How do I not share? Not share. Stop it. No.
That's not what they tell you in kindergarten. Please stop sharing.
I know, but I can't get my end show.
There we go.
Stop.
Well, that's okay. We don't need to. As you're working on it. My other thing. There you go.
Here we go.
You're good right there. We're all good.
Okay, good.
So my question is this: I'm amazed at how there's not just one way to contemplate Christ. There's all these ways. He could be stripped, he could be covered, he could be juxtaposed with other figures. So that shows to me the complexity of the human mind in meditation. There are many ways to contemplate Christ. But it does raise a question for me. Why do you think Mary is always veiled? Do you think that's something about her virginity, her purity, where she's always showed as
Yes, absolutely.
Instinctually, we wouldn't contemplate Mary's body so much, but always just her.
No. There's one this Italian guy. He does these religious commentaries once in a while, and they're very good videos. But he talks about how you can't market anything about the Blessed Mother. And he says you could do all these things about all the different saints and do this and make these different things, but you can't really. She is, and he did it in for the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. That there's nothing you can sort of joke about or anything you can, but it doesn't make any difference. It's not going to change things. So. Is everybody unmuted, or how's this work?
Yeah, so whoever this, as we do at St. Patrick's, it's a free for all. Just jump in if you have any questions or comments. Beryl, you look like you're ready to comment.
Yeah, in fact, Anthony and I talked during the week, and he wanted me to be sure to mention something I had mentioned to him, that to me, one of the real richnesses of the Catholic Church is the vastness of it in terms of the spectrum of ways to pray or ways to value it. We can go from a conservative or somewhat charismatic level to the mystics. And Anthony, you said you wanted to comment on that.
No, I want to hear more, but thank you. No, seriously, there are many different ways and many different traditions, and we borrow from both East and West. And I think we have a little bit, the artist in the West has a little bit of larger responsibility, in the sense that we're not told we can only do it this way, right? As they are in the Orthodox, where if you're depicting Christ of Holy Saturday, it's really the work of the crucifixion, and it's a wonderful icon, and we have translated it in many ways of this harrowing of hell. But if you're Russian or Greek Orthodox and you're doing the harrowing of hell, it is just that one aspect, and that one, you could paint it slightly differently, but compositionally, you're pretty much the same, you know. So both are wonderful traditions, but again, the West, with all of its being so open, becomes a little more complicated. So,
Anybody else, two comments on that? Other questions? We'll keep things rolling.
Yeah, I had a question. There was you had a couple of images of women breastfeeding prisoners. Was
yes.
that something that literally was true, or was that
Yes,
a metaphor, or
absolutely.
what's going on there?
No, that was called Roman charity. And there definitely was cases where lactating women would visit the prisoners, the imprisoned or the sick, and offer them breast milk.
Jim, the look on your face is enough of a response.
No, I think that's I think that's incredible. I mean, both on a literal as well as a metaphorical level. I think that's absolutely beautiful.
There is
One other
something
question
too.
I had.
There is something too about the Middle Ages. There's a little more comfort with the body.
Yeah.
Maybe that's because they had less technology to make us more sensitive. It's more corporeal. There's no air conditioning, no this, no cars. We use the body more, comfort with the body. You're confronting the body.
Well, it was also the most natural thing. I mean, now, I mean, I go to my doctor's, and in his room there, he's got these posters up of you know, a father holding his baby, and will say something like "mother's milk for daddy's baby." Where they would have never had a problem of mothers breastfeeding their children back then. It would be unheard of.
Yeah.
If a woman couldn't do it, she would hire a wet nurse, or he would hire whatever. There'd be I mean, I'm going to tell a family story right now where
there's no such thing as TMI on Zoom. It's fine.
No.
You going to talk about Grandma?
No, I'm going to talk about you and Joan.
Uh-oh, we got a family story. Family's on the line.
My mother and her sister both had daughters in around the same time. My sister and her dearly beloved Joan, God rest her soul. And they would swap. And one would nurse one, and one would nurse the other, to the point where sometimes we'll criticize my sister, saying that it was my aunt's milk that made her that way, and vice versa, that my mother's milk made my cousins that way.
Now, as an Irishman, I might say this seems like an Italian Philly thing. This is.
Oh, I don't know how Philly that is, Father. I don't know.
But Anthony, Grandma's a canny. One of the Eli's could not breastfeed her child. So Grandma did. She was the wet nurse for one of the Eli's.
Okay. There you have it. Philadelphia.
That's Philadelphia.
Now, Jim, again, this is legal conversation. I just said we can't get to the mystical side of this in visions. That's off limits. But Jim, what was your second question?
Oh, thank you. I have a lot of questions, actually. But the other thing I was going to mention, I was at Williams College about 2 years ago. They have a terrific gallery there. And I think it dated to the late 17th century, late 1600s, where it was under the reign of Philip I as well as Philip II. And it was art that showed nudes that was available only to the elite, the upper class of the times. And in a lot of cases, it was the masses that they were exhibiting, but they weren't for general exhibit. It was just for the royalty and the folks at the top of the food chain. Do you know anything about that?
Well, I said before we opened up about the Academy of Fine Arts having Women's Day and Men's Day to see the plaster cast collection, which is essentially your cast of European statues and sculptures that were, nude. So yeah, it was sort of a separatist thing, but that I don't think that happened in Catholic Europe, where only the conoscenti could see works of nudity. That sounds like something that's clearly post Reformation in a way. I don't because when you visit these cities and you see the cathedrals and you see the public work, there's no prohibition there at all, obviously.
And not to over theologize people's instincts in viewing art, but there is something, again, to repeat, is that the Protestant notion from Luther starts to really focus on the body as evil, the body as sinful. And that's never been the ancient Christian view, is that our obsession or our over focus on the body is sinful. That's technically called concupiscence, but the body is good. It's a creation of God. It reveals many things, as we're seeing, and can be used as a sort of, as John Paul II will say, the language of the body. Now, Anthony's using different categories, but John Paul will say too, it's this sense of giving yourself and mutual sort of possession of one another in marriage. So there's the goodness of the body is the Christian worldview, and that has been changed by emphases of Luther and others. And then there's but that's just worth repeating.
Well, Father Tim, what that reminds me again is, to me, the richness and the vastness of the Catholic Church. Because what I'm hearing you say is that Protestantism started taking things out of the mystical and bringing them into more of a tangible, and taking away the mystical, not the magical, but the mystical.
And there's something good in that instinct. It can't rain. It's not good when it rains, but there's something good in the instinct of simplifying to, listen, going back to the gospel text and not always only looking at symbols as you exit the door. There's something to that, right? There's something to, long before Protestantism, the Benedictines and the Cistercians, they would have the whitewashed walls, they would have the clear glass, something about a simple chapel. So it's not to say that it can't be an emphasis, but when it has this heavy notion of we're only sinners, we're fallen, that starts to become aggressive and theologically in error when that's not just an emphasis. You see how even as Anthony gave this survey, there's a survey of commentary of meditating not just one way, if that makes sense.
Right.
And that can be the wrong type of it's bullying, really.
Yes.
Stripping altars and stripping churches. It starts with a little theological emphasis, but it becomes destructive, like iconoclasm, which the East had to deal with for hundreds of years. Which, interestingly enough, if you go to the Dark Ages class we gave, there were two different women empresses who really finally saved icons, because there was such an emphasis on simplicity that it became heretical. Like St. Dominic and the Albigensians, they were becoming so poor, or the spiritualists of Franciscans and Dominicans, both popes warned against this in the 1300s and 1400s, saying, we can't be so strict that we forget humanity. Christ took on humanity. There's nothing evil here, not ordered, but God's creation is still good. And that has to be emphasized every generation.
Another part of our conversation this week with Beryl was, and George Nista knows who I'm talking about, Michele. He's a wonderful Italian teacher, and a lot of people will, for where we are today in this religious art or whatever, nudity, all these different things, we here in the United States just will blame the Puritans. Anyway, one day during my session with Michele, I found out that he smoked. And I said, Michaela, oh yeah, I smoke. It's always the same thing with a lot of Europeans, or I should say Mediterraneans. They have this thing where I only smoke Friday after dinner. I only smoke weekends. I only smoke 2 in the morning after coffee. And I said, I don't understand this, because here we have, you're a smoker, you're a non-smoker, you're this, or it's all black and white. And in fact, even in Italy, when you buy cigarettes, it doesn't say it may cause this, that, blah, blah, blah. It's got a skull and crossbones saying, this will kill you. How many do you want? So there's clear warnings. But anyway, Michele said, well, you're all, it's very Calvinist. He said, even though I'm an atheist, I still come from a Catholic culture. Well, now I'm really confused. So then he goes on to say, well, in Catholicism, you don't have heaven or hell just that simply, and you're already pre-condemned, or you're already saved, so you don't have to do anything. That's presumption is fair. But he said, here, in Catholic culture, you've got heaven, hell, limbo, purgatory, how many days, how many months, how many years. You've got all these variations. He said, just like smoking. So he made me realize we are not puritanical here. We're more Calvinist than anything.
Well, and also, like humans, we're all, since the fall, a little bit of a contradiction,
Yeah, that too.
Much as we can talk about the goodness of the body, there are also dangers and the lure of the body, especially in our culture today. It's getting semi-insane how much the body is put too much on display, or in different ways with different connotations. But let's so John Bellardo wrote in the chat, I just want to get a few more comments in. He says, a beautiful end to the grapes of wrath, the Steinbeck, is also that same thing about a woman who feeds a starving man in the Great Depression as a wet nurse. That's from John Steinbeck.
Oh, wonderful.
Which I know a lot of Americans are shocked by, but it wouldn't be as shocking to medievals or people from Northeast Philly, I guess. So another thing too, just to comment.
You're confusing Northeast with Southwest. That does not happen in Northeast.
I'm having fun because here we are. Quick thing too is Charlene asked the question, what is the difference between nudity in the Garden of Eden, where the nude is not evil, and yet in hell the damned are naked? So those are contrasted, right? The paradise.
Sure.
So can you speak to that briefly?
Because one is, again, the nudity before the expulsion is the nude. After the expulsion, it's naked. It's without. It's lacking. It's depraved. It's considered criminal. And that's because of either disbelief that God created Adam and Eve whole, or that some other infraction has been committed, some other thing has come in. So, there's the elect and the damned are two separate forms of nudity, as it is in art.
I'll also comment on that briefly, that John Paul II, long before he wrote Theology of the Body, he was elected Pope and he wanted to publish this book. He had already written Theology of the Body, and he was told popes don't publish books. So that's why he gave it as Wednesday Audiences, and eventually they made it into a book. Oh. Then Joseph Ratzinger was elected, and right away he publishes Jesus of Nazareth, Volume 1, a commentary on the gospel. So all of a sudden popes are publishing books. I mean, the rebel was Joseph Ratzinger, which is funny, not John Paul II. But he wrote a book while he was before he was Pope, called Love and Responsibility. And there's a concept I like to talk about very briefly, which I think is very helpful. He talks about shame, because after the fall, Adam and Eve had shame. And also he talks about the absorption of shame by love. The human beings, shame and covering the body is a proper response to those who have sinned, because we realize we don't see things right anymore. Adam and Eve, Adam could look at Eve and say, this at last is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh, meaning her bone and her flesh are like mine, meaning as I know myself as a human with freedom and dignity, and I know myself as a full person, I also look at this woman in the same way. That she is bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, interiority of my interiority, soul of my soul. There's a sense of, he sees Eve as she is, body and soul, and as a daughter of God, full of grace. Adam and Eve cover themselves because they lose that vision, and we all share that fallen vision. Now, it doesn't mean we're bound to that. My two statements are this. First, I think what we're doing tonight is a little bit of a recovery. Every time a person views the human body in a way that it leads them to consider the soul and the spiritual messages and the spiritual battle going on, that is an Adamic, that is Adam's contemplation of seeing body and soul coordinated together in harmony. We recover some of Adam's eyes when we see art done properly. It actually helps us, it actually heals us. Art can be therapeutic in the spiritual sense in that way. It can be instrumental and give us grace. Contemplating the body can lead to spiritual contemplation, what's happening in these people, just like Adam saw Eve's body and contemplate also her soul and her status as daughter of God. But my second thing too, that John Paul, I think, says is very helpful, that shame is a proper reaction to cover. But he talks about later in marriage, the absorption of shame by love. When you know someone thoroughly after shame has put up a fence enough to give you time to get to know each other, then it is absorbed by love, that shame, meaning now there is a proper nudity and not just a nakedness of like an advertisement or a magazine or whatever, because the order is being restored, that love absorbs shame in time, not only, I would say, in marriage between a couple, but also as we see contemplating paintings. There's a proper, I think even doctors and nurses can go through caring for people's bodies as proper reverence. Love can reclaim and absorb the shame that's put in place. Shame is a proper reaction, but love can grow. And I think that's what we've been doing tonight. And I think that's what can happen for Christian growth. Yep, seeing body and soul properly together, not perfectly, but growth. Anybody else too before we go? We have.
Well, I wanted to ask about the painting, Anthony, of Adam and Eve being tempted by the serpent. The serpent has a purple tail, and there's a fountain in the background.
Well, I would say the fountain is probably a reference to living water.
But can you tell me the artist or the name of the painting?
I have to look at it again, Caroline.
Thanks.
And
Yeah,
that'll also
sorry.
come up, and not to cut you off, Caroline, but we're doing the demonic in art is Holy Week, right? Because that's when Satan.
Do you renounce Satan, his or her? But as for the color purple, I can tell you that's more or less part of what artists were doing for centuries. That the satanic or the beast is never clearly male or female, beast or animal, or excuse me, human or animal, not to be painted or depicted in natural color either. Mm-hmm. So that's some of the reasoning there.
Maybe another question too. So Paul Grass asks, Anthony, do many artists draw the figure and place clothing on them without using reference for the drapery?
Yes, I just wrote to Paul. I do. When I'm composing, again, if you know the anatomy of drapery, which we've sort of broken down to 7 types of folds.
Well, that's I'm gonna cut. That has to be another lecture. 7 types of folds.
Oh yeah,
I'm not worthy of that yet.
If you know what generates a fold, and they all have names, right? You can, if you say this is what's holding this up or stopping this, you know exactly what kind of fold it should occur, and then you could do variations of it, and then that's
what do you call that, Anthony, as well, when you say you're not just learning anatomy, learning folds, learning light and shade, but when it becomes second nature, when it becomes instinctual? You've told me about that before.
Oh, well, there's a whole tradition of what we call form memory, but form memory is also light memory, it's perspective, it's all of it. And it was being taught at the sort of end of the 19th century by, in fact, I've got the book, or not the book, but a good copy of it by Bois Boudrin, The Training of the Memory for the Artist. And he based it on music, because and it's something we still practice, which is solfeggio, which is the study of of perfect pitch and the scales, so that a musician could just sing or play anything, and the vocalist or I would know exactly what note that is and what key it's in. Well, that's still being done at AVA on Spruce Street and
Juilliard.
excuse me.
Juilliard.
Yeah, at Juilliard. Thank you, Beryl. So he sort of put this course together for the visual artist and said, if you can do solfeggio, why can't you train the memory for the artist? The problem is he didn't illustrate the book. But, I've gained enough from it to formulate the exercises. And you didn't apply it to anything. Just so you wouldn't study solfeggio without applying it to some sort of melody or lyric. He didn't do that. So he just takes it a little too basic, but the exercises can be done, and they are great training for form memory. And then after form memory, you do light and shade memory, which every artist knew, by the way. You look at all these drawings and everybody knows how to do parallel light and shade, 45 degrees left to right, parallel to the picture plane. Boom, done. Now do variations of it. Then move on to radial light. Things like, this was part of what we spoke about last week with light and shade, but that's the sort of classroom part of it, as it were, the science.
Anthony, kind of out of left field, as we're wrapping things up, Jonathan Smith sent in the chat a link to some photos he had taken, and
where do I see this stuff?
well, I'll copy and paste and send it to you. But
Okay.
he also has a little preview of the Holy Week lecture on the demonic. Why the horns? Maybe you could save that. Do you want to give a preview? Why the horns?
Why the horns on what?
I guess the temperature.
Because again, it's unclear whether the seducer is animal or human.
Is it serpent? Is it angel? Yeah,
Exactly. Sometimes they have wings. Sometimes they have tails. Sometimes they look. In terms of modern depiction, I'd say the person who hit it incredibly well is Mel Gibson in Passion. You don't know what that is.
Right.
If I could find a picture, and I've looked, but that one scene in the Garden of Gethsemane where you see the snake tail run up its nose, very alarming in a way, very creepy, and the constant temptation.
I may correct you as a student of Mel Gibson that it's actually a maggot that crawls up Satan's nose, where a snake comes from under the garment. But we'll get into that later.
Well, see, that's what I mean. You don't know whether it's a man or a woman, a maggot or a snake. There you go.
But listen, we'll end officially. If people want to keep chatting, we don't have to end the Zoom thing, but we want to at least just kind of give an end to the Q&A. And so thank you all.
Yeah, and if there are more, sorry, not to interrupt, but if there are other questions, you could either save them for next week, or I don't know how you can add them to this after the fact, after we close. But
Right. Well, we'll officially end here. But then if people want to stay on and chat, that's fine too. So thank you again, Anthony. One final round of applause for your continued hard work.
Thanks again for the opportunity, Father. I'm enjoying this.
For sure. Me too. All of us are.
All right. Take care. Good night, everyone.
Good night, Anthony.
Bye-bye.
Good night.